They buried her in the red dust. She returned on horseback, eyes full of fire, Wild West Gothic. They buried her in the red dust. She returned on horseback, eyes full of fire. The bullet tore through Catherine Blake's chest at high noon, blood spreading across her cotton dress like spilled wine. She dropped to her knees in the main street of Redemption Valley, dust rising around her fallen body. Sheriff Cole Hammond stood over her, smoking revolver still raised, his face twisted with something darker than justice. The townspeople watched from behind their windows, curtains drawn just enough to see but not enough to be seen. No one moved to help her. No one called out. They had learned long ago that speaking against Hammond meant joining the dead in the cemetery on the hill. Catherine's eyes remained open as she fell forward, staring at the red earth that would soon cover her. Her last thought was not of fear or pain, but of the promise she had made to her younger sister, little Emma, who was hiding somewhere in town watching her only family die in the street. Hammond holstered his weapon and spat tobacco juice onto the ground beside Catherine's body. He turned to his deputy, a thin man named Vincent Crane, and gestured casually at the corpse. The gravediggers came within the hour. They were two brothers, Danny and Roy Harper, who had buried more innocent people in the past year than they cared to count. They worked in silence, their shovels cutting through the hard red clay on the outskirts of town, where the desert began to swallow the valley whole. The hole was shallow because Hammond did not pay for deep graves. He said the dead did not deserve comfort, especially not women who asked too many questions about missing cattle and murdered ranchers. Catherine had been asking questions for 3 months, ever since her father was found hanging in his barn. The sheriff called it suicide, but Catherine knew better. Her father had been a strong man, a fighter who had survived the war and built his ranch with his own hands. He would never abandon his daughters. She had started investigating, talking to other ranchers, discovering that Hammond and his men were running a protection scheme, killing anyone who refused to pay. She had evidence, papers hidden in her father's old Bible, names and dates and amounts. She was going to take it to the territorial marshal in the next county. Hammond found out the day before she planned to leave. He confronted her in the street, accusing her of horse theft, a hanging offense. When she denied it, he shot her without trial, without hesitation, without mercy. The town doctor, an old man named Peter Walsh, was forced to examine the body and declare her dead. He did so with shaking hands and tears in his eyes, knowing he was complicit in murder but too afraid to speak the truth. They wrapped Catherine in burlap and threw her into the ground before sunset. Roy Harper said a brief prayer, his voice barely a whisper, before they covered her face with red dust. By nightfall, the grave was filled and marked with a simple wooden cross that bore no name. Emma Blake watched from behind a water trough, her small fists clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. She was only 10 years old, but she understood what had happened. The bad men had killed her sister, just like they killed her father. She waited until darkness fell completely, before running to the church where Father Miguel had promised to hide her. The old priest took her in without question, giving her bread and water, telling her to pray for her sister's soul. But Emma did not pray for Catherine's soul. She prayed for something else entirely, something dark and desperate that a child should never have to ask for. She prayed for vengeance. 3 days passed. The town returned to its fearful routine. Hammond and his men continued their reign of terror, collecting money from shopkeepers and ranchers, beating anyone who looked at them wrong. On the third night, a storm rolled in from the desert, bringing wind that howled like wounded animals and lightning that split the sky into fragments of white fire. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Rain fell in sheets, turning the streets into rivers of red mud. And in the cemetery on the hill, the earth began to move. The ground above Catherine's grave cracked and shifted, dirt falling away as something pushed upward from below. Pale fingers emerged first, clawing at the mud, pulling with desperate strength. Then a hand, an arm, a shoulder. Catherine Blake dragged herself from the earth that had held her for 3 days, gasping for air that burned her lungs like acid. Her burial shroud fell away in rotting strips. The wound in her chest was still there, a dark hole that should have killed her, that had killed her, but now leaked something black and thick that was not quite blood. Her eyes opened, and they burned with orange light, like coals in a forge. She stood in the rain, mud sliding from her pale skin, and looked down at the town below. Thunder crashed overhead. Lightning illuminated her face, showing features that were Catherine's, but also something more, something ancient and angry. She began walking down the hill toward Redemption Valley, her bare feet leaving prints that smoked in the wet earth. Behind her, the grave remained open, empty, waiting. The storm continued through the night. In the morning, Danny Harper went to check the cemetery as he always did after heavy rain, making sure no graves had been washed out. He found Catherine's grave first, saw the displaced earth and broken cross, and his blood turned to ice water. He ran back to town faster than he had ever moved in his life, bursting into the sheriff's office without knocking. Hammond was eating breakfast, beans and bacon, when Danny stumbled through the door, pale as milk, unable to speak at first. Vincent Crane was cleaning his rifle in the corner. They both stared at the gravedigger as he finally found his voice and told them what he had found. Hammond laughed, said it was probably coyotes or grave robbers, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he did not quite believe his own words. He sent Vincent and 2 other deputies to investigate. They returned an hour later, confirming the story. The grave was empty. Catherine Blake's body was gone. Hammond ordered the town locked down. He posted men at every entrance, told everyone to stay inside after dark, claimed that grave robbers were operating in the area. But the people of Redemption Valley knew better. They had seen too much death, too much injustice, and some of them whispered about older laws than the ones written in books, about debts that could not be paid with money, about the land itself demanding justice when men failed to provide it. Father Miguel said nothing, but he prayed constantly in his small church, and he kept Emma Blake hidden in the cellar where no one could find her. He told her nothing about the empty grave, but somehow she knew. She could feel it in her bones, a warmth that had not been there before, a connection to something beyond her understanding. That night, the first of Hammond's men died. His name was Lucas Grant, a deputy who had participated in at least 5 murders over the past year. He was found in the stable behind the jail, hanging from a rope beam, his neck broken cleanly. His gun was still in its holster. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints in the hay except his own. The only unusual detail was the temperature in the stable. Despite the summer heat outside, the air inside was cold enough to frost the wood. Hammond examined the body himself, his face grim, and ordered it taken down and buried quickly. He told the other deputies it was suicide, that Grant had been troubled. No one believed him. They all knew Grant had been too mean, too cruel, too confident to kill himself. Something else had done this. The next night, 2 more men died. Carl Stone and Bobby Mitchell, both Hammond's enforcers, were found in the saloon after closing. They were seated at a table, cards still in their hands, but their eyes were burned out of their skulls, just empty black sockets that smoked faintly in the lamplight. The bartender, a man named George Willis, had locked up at midnight and found them at dawn. He swore he had checked the building before leaving, that no one had been inside. The doctor examined the bodies and could find no explanation for the burns. There was no fire, no powder marks, nothing that could have caused such injuries. Only that terrible cold that seemed to follow death now, as if winter itself had taken root in summer. Hammond knew then that something beyond his understanding was hunting him and his men. He gathered the remaining deputies in his office, 6 men who had helped him terrorize Redemption Valley for 2 years. They were all hard men, killers and thieves, but fear had found them now. They loaded their weapons with extra ammunition, barricaded the doors and windows, and waited for sunrise. Hammond paced the floor, his mind racing through possibilities. He thought about Catherine Blake, about the empty grave, and for the first time in his life he felt something close to regret. Not for killing her, he was too far gone for that, but for whatever he had awakened by doing so. Vincent Crane sat in the corner, his rifle across his lap, watching the door. He was the youngest of the group, only 23, and he had followed Hammond because the money was good and the work was easy. Shooting unarmed ranchers and scaring shopkeepers, it seemed like a fine way to make a living. Now he wished he had stayed in Texas, wished he had never heard of Redemption Valley. He could feel something watching them from outside, something patient and cold that had all the time in the world. The oil lamps flickered despite no wind. The temperature in the room dropped degree by degree until they could see their breath. Then the door, barricaded with furniture and nailed shut, began to open. It moved slowly, the wood splintering and furniture sliding aside as if pushed by invisible hands. The deputies raised their weapons, fingers on triggers, sweat freezing on their faces despite the terror heating their blood. The door swung fully open, revealing the dark street beyond, and standing in that darkness was Catherine Blake. She wore a long coat taken from somewhere unknown, her hair hanging wet and wild around a face that was beautiful and terrible. Her chest wound was visible through her torn dress, that black substance still seeping from it, but she stood straight and strong. Her eyes burned with that orange fire, illuminating the room like twin torches. When she spoke, her voice was her own, but layered with something older, deeper, as if the earth itself was speaking through her. She said only one word, Hammond. The deputies opened fire. Bullets tore through the air, striking Catherine in the chest, the stomach, the head. She jerked with each impact, but did not fall. The orange light in her eyes grew brighter. She began walking forward, slow steps that seemed to shake the building's foundation. One deputy, a man named Frank Morris, broke and ran, trying to escape through the back window. He made it halfway through before something yanked him backward with such force that his spine snapped audibly. His body fell to the floor, twisted at an impossible angle. The other deputies screamed and kept firing until their weapons clicked empty. Catherine stood in the center of the room now, surrounded by spent shell casings and gun smoke. Her body was riddled with bullet holes, but she did not bleed red. That black substance oozed from her wounds and dripped to the floor where it hissed and burned through the wood like acid. She turned her gaze to each deputy in turn, and as her eyes met theirs, they began to scream. Their voices rose in harmony, a chorus of agony, as invisible flames consumed them from the inside out. Their skin blackened and cracked, smoke pouring from their mouths and eyes. Within seconds, they were nothing but charred husks that crumbled to ash when they fell. Only Hammond and Vincent remained. The sheriff had backed himself into the corner, his revolver forgotten in his hand, his face gray with shock. Vincent had dropped his rifle and was praying, words tumbling from his mouth in desperate Spanish that Father Miguel had taught him as a child. Catherine approached Hammond slowly, savoring his fear, feeding on the terror that rolled off him in waves. She reached out with one pale hand and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. Hammond tried to scream, but no sound came out. He could feel her fingers sinking through his shirt, through his skin, through his ribs, reaching into his chest cavity and gripping his heart with impossible cold. She leaned close to his ear and whispered the names of everyone he had killed. Her father, William Blake. The rancher, Tom Peterson. The shopkeeper, Henry Cruz, and his wife, Maria. The drifter with no name who had witnessed a murder. 15 names in total, 15 lives taken for greed and power. With each name, Hammond's heart beat slower, harder, as if turning to stone inside his chest. When Catherine finished the list, she pulled her hand back, and Hammond's heart came with it, torn from his body but still beating in her grip. He stared at it for one impossible moment before his body collapsed. Vincent Crane had watched it all too, paralyzed with fear to move. Now Catherine turned to him, and he waited for death. But she stopped, her burning eyes studying him with something like curiosity. She could see his sins, every wrong he had committed, but she could also see something else, a young man who had made terrible choices, but who had never pulled the trigger on an innocent. He had held guns, had threatened people, but in the crucial moments he had always hesitated, always found excuses not to shoot. Catherine tilted her head, considering, and then she spoke again in that layered voice. She told him to leave Redemption Valley and never return, to go far away and live a different life, to help people instead of hurting them, to balance the scales however he could. She told him that if he ever returned, or if he ever raised his hand against the innocent again, she would find him no matter where he was, and his death would make Hammond's lip merciful. Vincent nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face, and she stepped aside. He ran from the office, through the dark streets, out of town without stopping, without looking back, running until his lungs burned and his legs gave out miles into the desert. He kept his promise. He went to California and became a teacher, spending 40 years educating children in a small farming community. He never spoke of Redemption Valley, and he never returned. Catherine Blake stood alone in the sheriff's office, surrounded by death and ashes. The fire in her eyes dimmed slightly, and for a moment she looked almost human again. Almost. She walked out into the street where the townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by the sounds of screaming and gunfire. They stared at her in silence. This woman they had watched die 3 days ago, this ghost with holes in her body and hell in her eyes. She looked at each face, recognizing the cowards who had hidden while she was murdered, the people who had known the truth but said nothing, who had let evil flourish because it was easier than fighting. She did not kill them. They had not pulled the trigger, had not stolen or murdered, had only failed to be brave. But she made sure they understood what they had allowed to happen, what their silence had cost. She spoke in that terrible voice, telling them that Redemption Valley was now under her protection, that any man who came here with evil in his heart would answer to her, that justice had returned to this place and it wore her face. The townspeople fell to their knees, some crying, some praying, all terrified. When she finished, Catherine turned and walked toward the church. Father Miguel was waiting outside, having felt her approach like a cold wind against his soul. Emma Blake stood beside him, having insisted on being there despite his protests. When Catherine saw her sister, the fire in her eyes flickered and dimmed further. For a moment her face softened into something recognizable, something human. Emma ran to her, throwing her small arms around Catherine's waist, crying into her coat. Catherine's arms came up slowly, hesitantly, and wrapped around the child. Her touch was gentle despite the power that thrummed through her body. They stood like that for a long time, sister and sister, the living and the dead, while the town watched in silence. Finally, Catherine spoke, and this time her voice was only her own, soft and sad. She told Emma that she could not stay, that what she had become was not meant for the world of daylight and ordinary life. She told her sister to be strong, to grow up good and kind, to never let fear turn her into something cruel. She told her that their father was proud of her, that they both were, and that she would always be watching over her from wherever it was she went when the sun rose. Emma sobbed and held tighter, begging Catherine not to leave, but she could already feel her sister fading, growing colder and more distant. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Catherine Blake began to dissolve like smoke in wind. Her body became translucent, then transparent, her features blurring until she was nothing but a suggestion of a woman, a memory made visible. The orange fire in her eyes was the last thing to disappear, 2 points of light that lingered for a heartbeat before winking out. Emma stood alone in the street, her arms empty, tears streaming down her face. Father Miguel came to her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, guiding her back into the church. The townspeople slowly dispersed, returning to their homes, knowing that everything had changed, but not yet understanding how. In the days that followed, they would find that the men Hammond had intimidated began to speak freely, that businesses reopened without fear, that travelers passed through safely. Redemption Valley began to heal, slowly rebuilding itself into something decent. But on certain nights, especially when the moon was dark and the wind blew from the desert, people would see a figure on horseback riding the perimeter of town. A woman in a long coat, her eyes glowing faint orange in the darkness, watching over them all. Some said it was Catherine Blake's ghost, forever bound to protect the place where she had died. Others said it was something older that had taken her form, an ancient force that demanded justice when men failed to provide it. No one knew for certain, and no one was brave enough to approach the rider to ask. Emma Blake grew up in Redemption Valley, raised by Father Miguel and several kind families who took turns caring for her. She became a teacher herself, educating the town's children, always emphasizing the importance of courage and standing up for what was right. She never married, never left the valley, and on her own deathbed, at the age of 78, she swore she saw Catherine standing in the corner of the room, smiling, reaching out a hand to guide her home. The people who were present said Emma's face became peaceful in that final moment, that she looked happy for the first time since she was 10 years old. The wooden cross marking Catherine's empty grave eventually rotted away, but someone always replaced it, generation after generation, making sure that spot on the hill was marked and remembered. The story of the woman who returned from death became a legend, passed down through families, told around campfires, whispered to children as both warning and hope. The details changed over time as stories do, but the core remained the same. Evil had come to Redemption Valley, and Catherine Blake had stopped it, paying the ultimate price and then somehow paying it again. In the modern age, the town still exists, though now it is called Red Valley, and most people have forgotten why. The cemetery on the hill remains, and tourists sometimes visit, taking pictures of the old graves, never knowing the truth of what happened there. But local residents, especially those whose families have lived there for generations, know better. They respect the cemetery, never vandalize it, always maintain the graves. And on certain nights when the wind is right and the moon is dark, some of them still see the rider, a woman on horseback, moving through the shadows at the edge of town.
They do not fear her.
They have learned that Catherine Blake, or whatever she has become, is not there to harm them. She is a guardian, a sentinel, a promise that in this one place justice will always find a way. The innocent have nothing to fear from the rider with fire in her eyes. But those who come to Red Valley with violence in their hearts, with plans to hurt and steal and destroy, they learn too late that some debts cannot be escaped, that some graves do not hold what they are meant to hold, and that vengeance, when it is righteous and true, can reach from beyond death itself. The red dust that covers the valley blows in the wind, eternal and patient, remembering everything it has seen, and somewhere in that dust, in the very soil of the land, Catherine Blake remains, sleeping perhaps, or watching, or simply existing in a state beyond human understanding. She is the protector and the protected, the victim and the avenger, the dead who will not rest, and the justice that will not be denied. Her story is written in the red earth itself, permanent and unchanging, a testament to the truth that some wrongs are so deep they scar reality, and some people are so strong that even death cannot stop them from keeping their promises. In the end, that is what matters most. Catherine Blake made a promise to her sister, to her father, to herself, and to all the victims of Hammond's cruelty. She promised that their deaths would not be in vain, that evil would be punished, that the innocent would be protected. She kept that promise with her last breath, and then she kept it from beyond the grave, and she keeps it still in whatever form she now takes. The people of Red Valley sleep soundly at night because they know she is out there riding the perimeter, watching the roads, her eyes full of fire that will never go out. And that is the story of Catherine Blake, the woman they buried in the red dust, who returned on horseback to claim what was rightfully hers: justice, vengeance, and eternal vigilance. Let those who hear this tale remember that courage comes in many forms, that death is not always the end, and that some fires once lit burn forever in the darkness, lighting the way for those who need protection and striking terror into the hearts of those who deserve it. The red dust remembers. Catherine Blake remembers. And the valley, forever changed by what happened there, remembers too. The wind blows through Red Valley tonight, as it does every night, carrying with it the whispers of the past and the promise of the future. Somewhere in that wind, if you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of hoofbeats steady and sure, the rhythm of a horse and rider who will patrol these streets for all eternity. The rider's coat billows behind her in the breeze. Her hat is pulled low over her face. But her eyes, those terrible and beautiful eyes, burn bright orange in the darkness, and anyone who sees them knows instantly that they are in the presence of something beyond mortal understanding. Catherine Blake has become legend, has become myth, has become something more than human and less than divine, existing in the space between life and death where all debts are paid and all promises are kept. She is the ghost story that parents tell their children to teach them about justice. She is the nightmare that haunts those who would prey on the weak. She is the hope that sustains those who suffer under tyranny. She is all these things and more, forever riding the edge of Red Valley, forever watching, forever waiting for the moment when she will be needed again. And she will be needed again. Evil never dies completely, no matter how many times it is beaten back. It returns in new forms, wearing new faces, speaking new lies, but always seeking the same old goals: power, control, domination over others. When it comes to Red Valley, when it thinks the stories are just legends and the past is just history, Catherine Blake will be there to remind everyone that some truths transcend time, that some warriors never surrender their posts, and that the price of evil is always, always paid in full. The red dust settles as night deepens over the valley. Stars appear overhead, cold and distant, indifferent to the struggles of humanity below. But Catherine Blake is not indifferent. She cares deeply about this place, about the people who live here, about the memory of everyone who suffered and died under Hammond's rule. That care, that love, that determination to protect is what keeps her bound to this world even when she should have moved on to whatever comes next. It is her blessing and her curse, her gift and her burden. Father Miguel, long dead himself now, once said in a sermon before he passed that Catherine Blake was proof that God had not abandoned them, that divine justice existed even in the darkest places, and that sometimes angels wore gun belts and rode horses instead of flying with wings. Whether he was right or wrong, whether Catherine is blessed or cursed or simply determined beyond all measure, remains a matter of debate among theologians and philosophers. But for the people of Red Valley, the question is academic. They know what they have seen, what their ancestors saw, and what their children will someday see. They have a protector, and that is enough. The story ends where it began, in the red dust of Redemption Valley, now called Red Valley, where a woman named Catherine Blake died and was buried and refused to stay dead because she had promises to keep. Her grave on the hill still stands, still empty, a hollow monument to defiance and determination. People leave flowers there sometimes, or coins or small notes thanking her for her service. Whether she sees these offerings or even cares about them, no one knows. But they continue anyway, because humans need rituals, need ways to express gratitude and respect, need to believe that their small gestures matter in the vast indifference of the universe. And perhaps they do matter. Perhaps somewhere in whatever state of existence Catherine Blake now inhabits, she sees those flowers and coins and notes, and perhaps they give her comfort in the long, lonely hours of her eternal vigil. Perhaps they remind her that she is not forgotten, that her sacrifice was not in vain, that the people she died protecting remember her name and honor her memory. Or perhaps she is beyond such concerns now, focused only on her duty, watching the roads and the streets with tireless orange eyes that never close and never stop burning. The moon rises over Red Valley, casting silver light across the desert landscape. Somewhere a coyote howls, and somewhere else a dog answers. Lights glow in windows as families settle in for the night, children being tucked into bed, adults finishing evening chores, the ordinary rhythms of ordinary life continuing as they always have and always will. And above it all, watching it all, protecting it all, rides Catherine Blake, The woman who would not stay dead, the guardian who accepted damnation to ensure others could live in peace, the eternal rider whose story will never truly end as long as there are people who remember to tell it. They buried her in the red dust, but the red dust could not hold her. She returned on horseback with eyes full of fire, and that fire burned still, a beacon in the darkness, a warning to the wicked, a comfort to the righteous, forever and always, world without end.